Hello! Look, I'm sorry that I haven't uploaded anything in 2 weeks. Finals came up at the school that I go to, at the college that I go to. So as a result of finals, I got very busy, couldn't upload stuff. But guess what? I have vacation now, since finals are over, which means I have more time to upload more stuff. So that's good. Anyway, so 2 weeks ago, I made a video entitled Defending Richard Spencer, where I talked about a certain video or a leaked audio that came up about Richard Spencer, and I explained why it's a disingenuous attack on him, the attack that was going on against Richard Spencer 2 weeks ago. I got some interesting comments and replies from Nick Fuentes fans that I wanted to share and kind of respond to. But more importantly than that, I want to clarify some of the things that I've said about Nick Fuentes and some of the concerns that I'm starting to have with Nick Fuentes and the groyper movement. More importantly, I want to get this off my chest because there is certain things that I'm starting to become concerned about with regards to the groypers and the direction the groyper movement is headed. So for context, I want to quickly read out the conversation that took place under the video defending Richard Spencer. So a commenter who I will leave anonymous replied, quote, "While I agree with the..." Jeez, I can't read today. Anon says, "While I agree that this is an unfair attack on Richard Spencer, the dissident right needs to get away from the whole Charlottesville Richard Spencer thing. I mean, people don't even know what a unified race was, and you're talking about an ethnic state that has a likelihood 0.0000001% chance. Nick Fuentes and America First is a much better thing to go towards." Anon here is, of course, referencing that I don't know this for certain, but I think that when Anon says me talking about an ethnic state, I think he's referencing my other video called The Solution, where I talked about establishing a white ethno-state in certain parts of the United States. Now, I, of course, using my Wolf username, replied the following, quote, "I understand where you're coming from. I do think that the alt-right would have been better off if Jared Taylor was its leader rather than Richard Spencer. However, I am beginning to see a major problem with Nick Fuentes and America First, which is the same problem that mainstream conservatism has. They are afraid of being too controversial. The reason why Shapiro and Kirk are the sellouts that they are is in part because of fear of not being popular. This fear also seems to exist in the groyper movement. Nick wants to distance himself from ethno-nationalism despite being in favor of it 2 years ago. Also, for reasons that I talked about in other videos, I think that there will be an economic crash. When that day comes, the chance of there being an ethno-state will be a lot higher. It's fine if you disagree. Part of what I like about dissident right-wing politics is that people say what they think." Anon then replied 2 things. Anon's first reply was, quote, "You have a good point. White identity seems like something Nick is shying away from, and you're right about the economic crash, just like the Weimar Republic. when it not only had a society crash, but also an economic crash, things really start to change. I still think it's unrealistic to want a total white ethno-state. I mean, we are going to send every non-white individual on a boat back to the third world country and people are just going to be fine with it. I think it's more realistic to strive for a white majority. My biggest problem with Spencer and why I support Nick Fuentes is religion. Christianity is absolutely vital to the West. The West was built on Christianity, and religion is what brings people together equally as race does. And Jesus is our Savior. And only He can conquer the evil in this world. Well, there's definitely a lot of truth to that last statement about Jesus. Also, and this is the second reply that Anon made. Also, I get you shouldn't hide truth, but Richard Spencer killed the alt-right by always talking about the ethno-state. Say what you want about Nick, but he did revive the momentum of the dissident right. Again, there's a lot of truth there. So, first I'll start out by addressing some of the stuff in this, then I'll move on to the other conversation that I had with a different groyper that I want to read out, and then address the stuff in that. So, to reply to Anon, how should I phrase this? Anon here did acknowledge that Nick Fuentes is shying away from... Anon did acknowledge that Nick Fuentes is shying away from white identity, despite, of course, advocating for ethno-nationalism openly before Nick Fuentes blew up with the whole groyper thing. But think about it like this. If Nick Fuentes is too scared, and for lack of a better word, to shy away from white nationalism or ethno-nationalism, despite being in favor of it before he got big on YouTube, before he got famous with the groyper wars, if Nick Fuentes is going to distance himself from those ideas because they're controversial, what's going to stop him from abandoning other principles that he has now? If in late 2019, white nationalism is controversial and extremely controversial, and the term alt-right or ethno-nationalism is extremely controversial, if Nick Fuentes is going to shy away from that because it's controversial, then what would happen if, let's say, in 2021, it becomes too controversial to say anything bad about Israel? Is Nick Fuentes going to stick to his anti-Israel stance? Or is he going to start cucking to the Israeli lobby and start distancing himself from people that talk about the USS Liberty? Or what if 30 years from now, or 20 years from now, or even 10 years from now, the Christian values that Anon here espouses, what if that becomes controversial? Is Nick Fuentes going to abandon that just like he abandoned white nationalism? You know, if Nick Fuentes is going to shy away from beliefs and ideologies because they are controversial, what's going to stop him from shying away from other stances that he has now? This is something that this fear of controversy is, of course, part of the reason why, personally, I absolutely despise what is commonly referred to as conservative Inc., the Charlie Kirks and the Ben Shapiros and all all of them. But that tendency, unfortunately, I am beginning to see that with the groyper movement, and it is concerning. Now, I'm not saying this, I'm not anti-groyper. I am in support of the groypers going to Charlie Kirk's events and Ben Shapiro's events and asking questions that Ben Shapiro and Charlie Kirk don't have the balls to answer. So, what the groypers are doing and what Nick Fuentes is doing, I'm in full support of. But this fear of controversy that I'm beginning to see within the groyper movement is kind of concerning. Now, I'll go through all the different stuff that Anon here said, and then I'll move on to the other guy that I want to talk about. He says, oh, we're going to send every non-white individual on a boat and return them to the third world. If you watch the video that I made on solutions, I never said we should send non-white people, all non-white people, back to the third world. Now, that's obviously something we should have done when that was actually realistic, but unfortunately we've reached a point now where trying to take every single POC in the United States and send all of them back to the third world where they came from is not realistic because there's just too many of them. What's more realistic is a sort of balkanization process, and this is something that I talked about in other videos, but I'll briefly summarize this quickly. So what you would do in this balkanization process is you would divide the United States into different states. One territory, of course, would be the white ethno-state, the white, right-wing ethno-state, and it would be where the white people live. And you would have another territory, California, Nevada, and those places, that would be the liberal shithole, or where all the crazy leftists live. And then you have New York, and then New England, the Washington, D.C. area, and New Jersey, and parts of Pennsylvania. That would become its own country, and that would be where and then that would be where the crazy leftists on the East Coast live. So you have roughly 3 countries. You have the white ethno-state, then you have the state run by crazy leftists on the West Coast, and then you have the state run by crazy leftists on the East Coast. What you would do is this. You would divide America into these 3 states, roughly speaking, and then you would give economic incentives, or you can move them. You would move or mass migrate all of the POCs that are living in the territory that we want the white ethno-state to be in, into the crazy leftist areas. While at the same time you would take all of the white right-wingers who are living in the West Coast areas and the East Coast areas, and you would bring them into the territory through migration into the white ethno-state area. So it would be mass migrations of different people. You would have the people of color that currently live in the territory that we want the ethno-state to be in, mass migrating into the East Coast shitlib area and then the West Coast shitlib area, while at the same time you have white Republicans migrating from places like California into the white ethno-state, or places like New York or New England into the white ethno-state. So it's not deporting people back to the third world. That's not realistic. But what is realistic is a sort of balkanization process, a sort of breaking up of the United States along political, cultural, and racial lines. Now, what else? He says that we should strive for a white majority rather than a total 100% white country. Well, here's the thing. If you have, say, a white ethno-state that has a population of, let's say, 10%. I have this frog in my throat. That has a population of, say, 10% racial minorities, but let's say that this 10% of racial minorities has higher birth rates than the white population. And on top of that, they're left-wing. And yes, most non-white people, at least in the United States, are left-wing. Even if you have an overwhelming white majority, if you have a significant population of minorities, even if it's very small, but they have higher birth rates and they're crazy leftists, eventually you're going to have the same problems that we have now with demographic change. And finally he says that his reasons for supporting Nick Fuentes over Spencer is because of religion and that Christianity built the West. Yes and no. You know what? Religion is a whole nother topic that honestly requires a whole nother video. So I'm not going to get deeply into religion now, but I will say this one thing. The ancient Greeks had what we can call a civilization that was Western, and it was very highly advanced for its time. But the ancient Greeks did not have Christianity. Instead, they had pagan beliefs. Same thing with the Romans. What we call Western civilization did not begin with Christianity. It really began with Greek civilization and then later what became known as Greco-Roman civilization. Greco-Roman civilization, or at least for most of its history, was pagan rather than Christian. So that in and of itself kind of proves that you don't really need Christianity in order to build Western civilization. Now, I'm not saying that Christianity is a bad thing, and I'm not one of these, like, you know, neo-pagan LARPers that says, oh, Christianity was so bad, we gotta get rid of it, and we all have to convert to paganism and worship Odin. I'm not one of those guys, but it is a bit of an exaggeration to say that Christianity was the thing that was responsible for building the West. Certainly did a lot of good, I'm not going to deny that. It certainly built a very large portion of the West, but it's not the thing that was responsible for building the West. Oh, and in case you're wondering, my religion is Catholic. I am a Catholic. So, I'm not an atheist, and I'm especially not one of these, you know, pagan LARPers. But I don't think that you need Christianity in order for the West to exist. Now, in our current age, yes, I think we should try to preserve Christianity because the alternatives are worse. Atheism, Islam, feminism, those things are way worse than traditional Christian values. So I think that we should try to preserve Christianity and Christian values, but I don't think that Christianity is something that was required in order for Western civilization to exist. Now, there's the last thing that he says, that Richard Spencer killed the alt-right. No. To the extent that the alt-right was killed, it wasn't because of Richard Spencer talking about the ethno-state. The thing that really killed the alt-right as it existed in 2016 was not Richard Spencer or anything he did, but rather Charlottesville. Charlottesville was really the thing that caused the alt-right as it existed in 2016 and 2017 to not exist anymore. Now, I don't think that the alt-right has been killed. In fact, I don't even think the alt-right's dead, as some people claim. The alt-right still exists. Millennial Woes is still doing his stuff. The YouTube channels and people that are commonly associated with the alt-right are still active, and they're still red-pilling people. The ideology is still there. The only thing that's missing is the label. People are not really identifying with the label alt-right anymore, as much as they used to. People are now calling themselves dissident right-wingers. Now, I think that even just changing the label is a mistake because, for the same reasons that I mentioned before. If you become worried about popularity, if you start saying to yourself, okay, we have to abandon this thing because this thing it becomes too controversial. We have to abandon this label because it becomes too controversial. Well, what the left is just going to keep making every single label that you adopt controversial and every single ideology that you adopt controversial. So you're going to have to keep abandoning every single label that you adopt. Alright, so what I'll do is I'll read out the other conversation that I had with that other groyper, and then I'll respond to that, and then we'll call it a day. Okay, so to give you context, jeez. To give you context, the conversation that I had with this other groyper was under a video Monday Blue made about the groypers, and a person by the name of, actually we'll leave this person anonymous, just like we left the other person anonymous, was a groyper who essentially said, hey, listen, we're not alt-right, we're just American nationalists who recognize the problems with demographic change. And then I replied the following to this other groyper person. Bro, Nick has advocated for white nationalist views if you watch his past work. He defended ethno-nationalism on multiple live streams with people. But then, of course, since the video is deleted, I can't see the rest of this. But then the Anon replied, and of course I had this conversation under my real name, so real name, real first name, real last name. And then Anon says, there is an overlap in small way, but even Nick matured past those views, and they are terrible optics to be associated with. We are not anything like the alt-right. And then he says, people are willing to look past... Oh, then I commented saying, hey, listen, it's not smart to play the optics game for the groyper movement, because Nick is already not good optics, and the cookie joke that Nick made up. And if you're a groyper, if you're a Nick Fuentes fan, you probably already know about the cookie joke. I shouldn't need to get into that, but I said that the cookie joke would follow him for the rest of his life. And Anon says people are willing to look past the cookie joke. As proof of this, his subscriber count is going up. We can absolutely play the optics game, and one mistake is not going to hurt them. Then I replied to this, and I essentially said that normal people... How should I put this? Normal people are not going to make distinctions between, say, Nick Fuentes versus, like, a Richard Spencer type character versus, like, a hardcore neo-Nazi. And then he says, I think you're not giving normal people enough credit. People understand something as humor. And then he replied to me again. He said, boomers don't get it. The majority of Gen Z is the largest voting bloc, and we've managed to get some pretty mainstream voices rallied around. Okay, so this kind of summarizes one of my other issues with Nick Fuentes and the groyper movement. The groypers, from my talks with various people that are Nick Fuentes fans online, and this is also the impression that I'm getting from Nick Fuentes too. Nick and his followers seem to believe that if they ditch the label alt-right, denounce the alt-right, don't say they're white nationalists, don't advocate for any type of white nationalism, but pose as, like, brand themselves as American conservatives, then they will be quote-unquote good optics, and therefore they can get reforms done that they want. But there's, of course, a major problem with this thinking that I think a lot of Nick Fuentes fans and groypers are kind of missing, which is that the only people who make distinctions between, say, the only people that actually make distinctions between different groups of people within the distant right wing are people within the distant right wing. The only people who actually understand that there's a big difference between Nick Fuentes versus Richard Spencer versus, say, Andrew Anglin. The only people that understand that there's a difference between those three categories of rhetoric, and that not all of these guys are actually the same in their beliefs. The only people that actually understand that are people within the distant right wing. People outside of our subculture, people that are completely normal people and who are like mainstream conservatives, the type of person that would watch Ben Shapiro or Hunter Avallone or some mainstream conservative, rather than Nick Fuentes or Jared Taylor or Richard Spencer or Millennial Woes or Black Pilled or old broadcasts from Dr. William Pierce. normal people who are not in the distant right-wing subculture, normal people, normies, do not make distinctions between different groups of people within the distant right wing. From their perspective, people that have our beliefs, people that rebel, who are on the right but that rebel against mainstream conservatism or quote-unquote conservative Inc. From the perspective of normies, anyone to the right of Mark Levin is basically a Nazi. Now, before anyone gets mad at me, I'm not saying that I believe that Nick Fuentes is a Nazi. He's not. We all understand that. We all understand that Nick Fuentes is not a Nazi. In fact, we understand that a lot of people, even within the white nationalist sphere, even within the traditional alt-right, are not Nazis, are not National Socialists. In fact, some of them are even far from that. But the only people who understand that are people that are in our subculture. And yes, the distant right wing is a subculture. It's sort of a society within a society, if you will. The distant right-wing subculture. But from the perspective of people outside our sphere of the internet, from the perspective of the type of person that would watch Ben Shapiro regularly, or Candace Owens, anyone to the right of Mark Levin is a Nazi. Or or people that are close, or at the very least, people that are close enough to Nazism to where they might as well be Nazis. Now, again, I'm not saying Nick Fuentes and his followers are Nazis. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying normal people can't make the distinction. Now, you can get mad at me all you want. You can say that I'm not giving normal people enough credit. But that's the truth. The type of person that watches Ben Shapiro is going to look at the guy that talks about, the groyper that talks about the USS Liberty, and is not really going to be able to make the distinction between the guy that talks about the USS Liberty, but who is like an American nationalist groyper, versus the guy that wants an ethno-state. From the perspective of a normal person, there just is no distinction between groypers versus white nationalists versus alt-right versus fascists versus national socialists versus monarchists versus neo-reactionaries. There is no distinction between different groups of people within the dissident right wing. From the perspective of anyone outside the dissident right wing, all distant right-wing content, anything that is right-wing but that rebels against mainstream conservatism, is all the same shit in the minds of normal people. That's the harsh truth. So this idea that, oh, if we just pose as American nationalists and throw people that are further to the right of us under the bus, and and say that we are not white nationalists because and only because it's bad optics, I'm sorry, that's not going to work. The groyper movement is not going to be able to play optics. It's not going to be able to play the optics game. Now, how should I say this? When I say that the groyper movement should not try to play the optics game, I don't mean that the groypers should not be concerned about optics. I'm not saying that we should all dress up in brown shirt uniforms with swastika tattoos on our faces and be like National Socialist skinheads and just start acting like stupid people. No. We have to play optics to some degree, otherwise we can't reach anyone. But there needs to be a balance between avoiding really bad optics versus not being so good optics that you end up betraying your own principles and then consequently becoming no better than Charlie Kirk. The way you achieve this balance is saying what you actually believe, saying what is actually true. While presenting it in the best optics possible. So, you try to be as good optics as possible, but you don't compromise your ideology in the pursuit of good optics. Now, the impression that I'm getting from a lot of groypers is that a lot of them are people that would otherwise be white nationalists or in the alt-right, but that want to avoid white nationalism and the alt-right because, and only because, of its controversial nature and its bad optics nature. This is the impression that I'm getting from a lot of Nick Fuentes fans, and this is the impression that I'm starting to get from Nick Fuentes himself. I'm not saying that you have to adapt the label alt-right, and I'm not even saying that you should become white nationalist. If you don't believe in white nationalism, if you think that the ideology is stupid, then don't be a white nationalist. But if you are a white nationalist, you should not, or rather, if you're someone who doesn't identify as a white nationalist, but the only objection to white nationalism or the alt-right that you have is that it's bad optics, then that's not a good enough reason to not be a white nationalist. And if you are someone that would believe in white nationalism, but if it were not bad optics, then what you should do is advocate for what you truly believe. If you go down the road that the groyper movement seems to be in danger of headed, which is saying, oh, well, this label and this movement is bad optics, therefore we should abandon it. That's a very dangerous path to go down, because, number one, you're not going to be able to play the optics game. Nick Fuentes, yes, the cookie joke was humorous. It wasn't, like, nobody is saying that Nick Fuentes actually hates the group of people that was joked about in the cookie joke. Or nobody who actually knows anything believes that. But the cookie joke that Nick Fuentes made, unfortunately, and I don't like that the world is like this, but that's the world that we're living in. The cookie joke that Nick Fuentes made is going to follow him for the rest of his life. I'm sorry, but that's the case. And on top of that, Nick Fuentes, because of the stuff that he said in the past, is already seen as a very, very controversial figure. One could make the argument that he's actually worse optics than Richard Spencer could ever be. Now, JF, of course, did a video on the groyper movement where he gave 13 rules that they should follow. I'm not gonna list out them, but I will say that the groyper movement should not be, to summarize this entire video, the groyper movement should not be concerned about optics to the extent that it ends up sacrificing its own beliefs and its own ideology for the sake of optics. And on top of that, it should not throw people that are further to the right of them under the bus because they have bad optics, which seems to be what Nick Fuentes is increasingly doing with people like Richard Spencer and Patrick Casey and others. The groyper movement should say what it truly believes, but at the same time, say what it truly believes in the best optics possible. That is the only way you can find a golden mean, to use Aristotle's terminology, between optics cucking versus full-blown really bad optics. If the groyper movement, and I'm posing this as a friendly warning to people that subscribe to the groyper movement and people that are fans of Nick Fuentes, if the groyper movement continues to compromise its ideology and shy away from white nationalism because and only because of its controversial nature, and throw people that are white nationalists under the bus because of their bad optics or alleged bad optics, then it's going to cause the groyper movement to explode in catastrophe for two reasons. One, there's no logical reason why the groyper movement should try to play the optics game in the way that it is now, because it's already seen as bad optics because of the controversial nature of Nick, and because normal people can't make distinctions between different groups of people within the dissident right wing, which means that if you're in the dissident right wing, you are a Nazi in the eyes of normal people. And secondly, if you compromise your ideology and avoid things because they're quote-unquote bad optics, then you're going to end up compromising all of your principles eventually, because I mean, think about it. If Nick Fuentes says, hey, listen, we can't be white nationalists, we can't be alt-right because they are bad optics, how long is it going to take before Nick Fuentes says, oh, we have to respect transgender rights because not believing that it's okay for a man to cut his penis off is bad optics? Or how long is it going to take before Nick Fuentes says, hey, listen, we have to be okay with immigration because not being okay with immigration is bad optics? Or, one of the Nick Fuentes fans that I mentioned earlier said that he believes in Christian values. Okay, what if Nick Fuentes 30 years from now says, hey, listen, we can't advocate for Christian values because Christian values are bad optics? You see the kind of slippery slope that trying to avoid certain things and certain labels because they're bad optics can lead to? I mean, it's kind of the same mistake that people like Ben Shapiro and Hunter Avallone and Charlie Kirk make, and I don't want to see Nick Fuentes make that same mistake. I want Nick Fuentes to absolutely annihilate Conservative Inc. I absolutely despise Conservative Inc., by the way. I'm in support of anything that hurts Conservative Inc. If Nick Fuentes can destroy Conservative Inc., destroy the globalists, save our race, and make things not retarded, make society actually sane again, then by golly, I'll be a Nick Fuentes fan. I'll frickin' build a statue to Nick Fuentes if Nick Fuentes accomplishes his professed ideals. But there is this major flaw within the groyper movement that needs to be talked about and needs to be exposed. I want the groyper movement to succeed. Despite myself calling myself alt-right, I actually do support what the groyper movement has done in terms of bringing certain issues to the forefront and questioning evil bastards like Charlie Kirk. And honestly, I want them to keep up the good work. But it can't make the same mistakes as Charlie Kirk. It should not make the same mistakes as Charlie Kirk. Consider this a sort of friendly critique of the groyper movement, a constructive criticism. This criticism of the groyper movement it's not done out of malice. It's done as a sort of... It's done in the same spirit that trying to help a person that's about to jump off a cliff avoid jumping off a cliff is done in. This criticism of the groyper movement that I just made, it's not because I'm against the groyper movement. It's because I want the groyper movement to succeed in its professed ideals. And honestly, F Conservative Inc. I want Conservative Inc. to be absolutely frickin' annihilated. But we can't do that if we're not willing to enter into the realm of controversy, if we're not willing to say what we truly believe, and say what we truly believe even if what we truly believe is bad optics. Okay, I just needed to get this off my chest. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. If you agreed with anything that I said, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. This is Wolf. white nationalist alt-righter, traditionalist, right-winger who rejects conservative ink and mainstream conservatism, and who actually wants actual right-wing politics. This is Wolf, signing out.